Ever wondered what happens when you combine obsessive German engineering, unreliable technology, and Hitler's birthday? You get the Ferdinand tank destroyer, a 65-ton rolling catastrophe for its crew. It easily ranks among the worst vehicles Germany ever built. But could it really have been that bad? Let's explain. The story begins in 1940 with the German military looking for a breakthrough weapon. Porsche and Henschel companies were designing vehicles in the 30-ton class, but soon, with the emergence of heavier Soviet tanks, Hitler dramatically altered the entire German tank program, demanding heavier armor and the mounting of the famous 88mm flak gun for anti-tank purposes. These two companies were then competing for the future Tiger I. Ferdinand Porsche adapted his existing design to meet these new requirements, keeping his petrol-electric drive system. This system used two gasoline engines to power generators, which then produced electricity to run electric motors that actually moved the vehicle. In theory, this would remove the need for a complex mechanical transmission, but in practice, it would actually become the tank's biggest flaw. When the competing designs were demonstrated on Hitler's birthday in April 1942, the simpler and more reliable Henschel design proved much superior and was chosen for what would become the Tiger I. Porsche's creation suffered tremendously from overheating and engineering complexity and had to be cancelled. However, 100 Porsche chassis were already built, anticipating victory, and that is a lot of German steel and man-hours to be wasted during the war. Under intense wartime urgency, they got the idea to turn it into something else that also doesn't work properly, a heavy tank destroyer. And when we say heavy, we mean it couldn't cross almost any bridges with its 70-ton combat-ready weight. On 90 of the surplus chassis, they would weld a superstructure housing the new L-71 anti-tank gun. It had the same caliber, infamous 88mm like the one mounted on the Tiger I, but now with almost double the propellant charge and a longer barrel, giving it extreme muzzle velocity. It was actually the most powerful anti-tank gun the Germans had. It could easily destroy the heaviest Allied tanks at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, where they could only dream of returning fire effectively. The new vehicle was officially named Ferdinand in honor of Ferdinand Porsche. However, it would later be renamed Elefant. Turns out, it would embarrass his name, and the upgraded version was renamed to clear connections with the early design. We'll come to that. The new vehicle was essentially a large, mobile anti-tank gun with very thick armor. The entire front hull and casemate were 200mm thick, making it impervious to any Allied gun. For comparison, this was almost twice the thickness of the already well-protected Tiger I. The sides were 80mm, also giving it solid protection, although not invincible. The Ferdinand was designed specifically for the Eastern Front and the impending battle at Kursk, where on wide-open terrain, it would use its extreme frontal armor and gun range to its advantage in tank-on-tank combat. But not everything would go according to plan. Battle. In April 1943, two heavy tank destroyer battalions were formed, each with 45 Ferdinands. They had their hurried training and were sent by train to the east. Ferdinand saw its first combat during Operation Citadel as the Germans began their offensive at Kursk. Here, all except one Ferdinand ever produced would be deployed. They were immediately pushed into battle, and initial results showed terrifying potential. A group of Ferdinands, on their very first day of combat, destroyed 22 Soviet tanks at ranges over 2 kilometers. Returning fire from Soviet T-34s, anti-tank guns, and later even from IS heavy tanks, harmlessly bounced off their frontal armor. They blasted through the first Soviet defenses and caused serious destruction in just a couple of days of combat. However, their war luck would be short-lived, as ominous problems with the Ferdinand quickly emerged. Because the offensive was delayed multiple times, the Soviets had time to prepare extensive defenses with deep minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and artillery positions. Without proper mine-clearing support, Ferdinands were lumbering through minefields and blowing their tracks off one by one. But that's not really the Ferdinand's fault. The biggest issue was Porsche's innovative but terribly unreliable gasoline-electric drive, combined with a notoriously fragile suspension system. Operating under the massive weight of the vehicle, the two engines, generators, and electric motors crammed into the hull midsection were prone to constant overheating. It was just a question of time before something broke and immobilized the destroyer. Top speed was about 18 miles per hour on the road, while cross-country it could only crawl. In ideal conditions, it had an operational range of just 90 kilometers, but in reality, it would usually break down before even going through one fuel tank. And now, under combat conditions, this was just multiplied. The electrical system was particularly vulnerable to water and battlefield debris, the kinds of things that are rather common in, well, a war. By the way, if you get stuck in mud or slide off the road, well, that's probably it. Due to Ferdinand's weight, recovering it was almost impossible. It needed between 3 and 5 recovery vehicles or other tanks to pull it out, and even that was sometimes impossible. So in that case, it had to be blown up by its own crew. In fact, most of them were not destroyed by the enemy, but by their own crews to prevent capture when they became bogged down. Just a couple of days after the beginning of the operation, out of 89 deployed Ferdinands, only 12 were still operational. A few of them were penetrated through the sides or rear, and a couple more destroyed by direct heavy artillery hits or infantry attacks. But the majority of them were stranded in no man's land with damaged running gear. Because it was so rushed to the front lines, many of the key features an armored fighting vehicle should have were completely overlooked. First, it didn't have any machine guns. Infantry was supposed to protect it from being swarmed by enemy troops. However, such a large target as Ferdinand attracted all nearby artillery fire, and infantry was reluctant to be beside it. They preferred to stay far behind, so the crews didn't have any means to protect their vehicle at close range. And there were multiple instances of Soviet infantry destroying Ferdinands with grenades or Molotov cocktails. But this was the least of its problems. Visibility from inside was catastrophic, and the engines in the middle section were extremely loud. The fighting compartment was spacious, yes, but during combat it quickly became extremely hot and filled with fumes. Maintenance was extremely difficult and complicated. Crews would sometimes spend the whole day fighting, then the entire night helping mechanics with repairs, and then go back into combat, only to break down or hit a mine almost immediately. However, the still operational Ferdinands continued to push during the battle around Kursk, usually used as spearhead units. They were met for the first time with the new Soviet heavy tank destroyer, the Su-152. In one recorded engagement, one Ferdinand was directly hit by an Su's 152mm howitzer shell, coming from about 3 kilometers away. But with superior optics and a precise gun, several Soviet Sus were destroyed in return. With each passing day, the Ferdinand's reliability issues multiplied, and only a couple of them were combat-ready at any given time, while the others awaited repairs. Despite the setbacks, the surviving Ferdinands would become more effective when the tide of war turned, and the German army was now on the retreating end. Now they served as rearguard defense, protecting retreats, and could decimate Soviet tank charges from defensive positions. Destroying them in head-on attacks was impossible, even at point-blank range, but being outmaneuvered was still the Ferdinand's biggest worry. The two Panzerjäger battalions repeatedly begged headquarters for maintenance time to perform serious work on their vehicles. Their pleas were ignored, as the retreating German army desperately needed every operational vehicle to plug holes in their collapsing front lines. Now, as the Eastern Front was slowly but surely collapsing, most of the Ferdinands were sent back by train, and a program was launched to improve them. 39 out of the 90 built were completely lost at this point. The retrofit program began addressing the most glaring weaknesses. A hull machine gun was added for close-quarter protection, the commander got his cupola for better visibility, and what could be done around the engines was slightly improved as well. The tank destroyer was now named the Elefant to clear the bad reputation it had gained as the Ferdinand. Meanwhile, lighter and supposedly more reliable and faster tank destroyers were developed to carry the new 88, like the Jagdpanther and the Jagdtiger. Although they had undoubtedly great guns and solid protection, they were all suffering under the rapidly deteriorating condition of the German army. Even before all the refits were complete, the Allies opened a new front in Italy with the landing at Anzio. Elephants were rushed to Italy to stop the Allied advance, and immediately new problems emerged. Italy's mountainous ground, soft soils, and ancient infrastructure didn't go quite well with the 70-ton Elefant. One was lost after attempting to cross an old stone bridge, which collapsed, and the Elefant crashed down. Another one slid off a narrow hillside road, was impossible to recover, and had to be destroyed with explosives. A couple more broke down, and this was even before reaching the enemy. The ones that finally reached the Allies began fighting a retreat toward Rome. A number of advancing Shermans were destroyed by well-defensively positioned Elephants. However, Allied air supremacy wreaked havoc on the huge, slow-moving targets with fighter bombers, such as the feared P-47 Thunderbolt. At least 2 Elephants were destroyed by 500-pound bombs, and constantly harassed German crews couldn't repair or recover the ones that broke down. Elephants were yet again abandoned and destroyed. One was captured intact and shipped to the United States for evaluation. The last of the surviving Elephants were shipped back and formed into new units for the Eastern Front again. They saw heavy action in Ukraine, where problems didn't avoid them either. Springtime brought deep mud, where Elephants would bog down and overheat trying to pull themselves out. However, they broke quite a few Soviet tank offensives when positioned correctly. By 1945, Germany was already fighting a lost war. Only 4 Elephants were still semi-operational, but they weren't going to quit just like that. The last 4 Elephants were positioned south of Berlin to guard approaches to the capital, essentially just delaying the inevitable Soviet advance. On April 22, 1945, 2 of the Elephants engaged Soviet forces and fought until both of them broke down and were abandoned. The remaining 2 Elephants retreated to Berlin to support the last-ditch defense. They took their positions in the city and knocked out several advancing Soviet assault guns. Now completely overrun, the final 2 Elephant crews destroyed their vehicles and surrendered. ending its short but turbulent service. Only 2 Ferdinand/Elephants survived the war. One is displayed in Russia, one in the United States. If you found this video interesting, check out our channel for more.